Next, we're going to bring up Dr. Frumkin. He is an internist, environmental and occupational medicine specialist, and epidemiologist. He has served at Emory University's Rollins School of Public Health, the CDC, and the University of Washington School of Public Health. Dr. Frumkin is head designate of the Our Planet, Our Health program at the Wellcome Trust in London. His research interests include health aspects of climate change, energy policy, the built environment, and nature contact. He was educated at Brown, Penn, and Harvard. Welcome. Yeah.
Thank you, Charles. Good morning, everybody. It is wonderful to be here. Mike, Christina, the whole team, thank you for putting on this great event. Dick, thank you for being Dick. And it is really nice for the three of us to be together. It's very special occasions, very emotional. And in fact, I just want to, before I start, take a minute and be a little pedantic and address myself to the students in the audience. I've been reflecting all morning and last night also. You know, what do you take from moments like this in life? So one thing I'll point out, and I think you got this morning already, is that Larry, Dick, and I all lived in Atlanta at the same time when we began collaborating on this work. And we have all subsequently fled. Now, you might think that's a bad reflection on Atlanta. You can judge for yourself. But the lesson for students is, wherever you are is a laboratory. And if you observe carefully what's around you, it can trigger a lot of thinking and even bend the curve on your career direction, because the world has so much to offer us, and there are so many things to learn from careful observation of where we are. Second thing I want to point out is that among the three of us, Dick and I are the ones who have medical and public health degrees. Larry's degrees are, correct me if I'm wrong, landscape architecture and transportation planning, and urban planning. Who's the greatest public health scientist of the three of us? It's Larry. So I say this by way of saying that the research in this area is very, very multidisciplinary. Public health is just too important to belong only to public health people. So work with people from other fields and you'll have a great time. And the third thing I want to say is that as I came over here this morning, I was thinking about our book, and I realized I couldn't recall who was the first author. And I needed to see the picture that Dick showed before I remembered who was the first author. It was me. What do you know? But the fact that I couldn't remember that, I mean, I think the lesson there is it's much less important who gets credit and much more important to work with wonderful people and do the best you can working collaboratively. So those are the life lessons I've learned from working with Dick and Larry, and I've been reminded of this morning, and I'm glad to share them with you. Well, let me get on to doing my job. Talking about the healthy community issue through the global lens. The themes of today's discussion will be housing, green space, and transportation. Those are mostly local issues. But there is a global context in which all of this exists, and that's what I want to take the chance to talk about with you. So I'm going to begin with a planetary change, and I'll move through a series of topics, and this is not a particularly linear or coherent talk. I'm going to tee up a few topics, mostly because I want to tee up the discussion that we'll have when the three of us finally stop talking and we all get to talk with you. So these are socioeconomic trends over the last couple of centuries, and the pictures are very small. It's kind of a classic, iconic image from Will Steffen and colleagues at the Stockholm Resilience Institute. What you see here, if you can see it, this is population taking off. This is real GDP, foreign direct investment, fertilizer consumption, water use, paper production. Almost any parameter you can think of human activity has skyrocketed in the last century or two. This has been called the Great Acceleration. Larry mentioned energy toward the end of his talk. This is all about liberating vast amounts of energy from the large-scale exploitation of fuels, fossil fuels, coal, oil, and gas, that have enabled all of these things to happen. This is human activity on a scale that's unprecedented historically. It's been a very, very rapid change in the historical context. This is a picture taken in 1972 from one of the early manned space flights. And it enabled us to begin thinking about this Earth, this beautiful jewel floating in the heavens, as a fragile entity, and ask the question, how does all that human activity affect the Earth? It's an important question. All of that human activity, all of life exists in a biosphere that is as thick on the surface of the Earth in proportion as a layer of cellophane on a soccer ball. So all of the changes that we may bring about are changes that are affecting an extraordinarily fragile and thin layer on the Earth. And we are bringing about changes in that layer. So this is the second half of that set of pictures. And what you can see here is that carbon dioxide levels are rising to unprecedented points. You all know that. Nitrous oxide, methane, we're changing the atmosphere of the Earth in which it existed for millennia before us. Here is marine fish capture went up and then plateaued, and there's a reason for that. Ozone levels up, surface temperature up. So we are changing this Earth of ours. And that has big impacts on everything. It has impacts on the future of civilization. But in today's context, healthy communities, it has impacts as well. Now, this is another iconic image. This comes from another publication from the Stockholm Resilience Institute. This is the concept of planetary limits. The idea that there are limits beyond which we should not transgress, and if we do, we may threaten the stability of the Earth and undermine the conditions under which civilization has evolved. So what you can see here is climate change at the top. Novel entities refers to chemical moieties that have been introduced into the environment and that in many cases are persistent. Here's ozone depletion, here is atmospheric aerosol loading, and so on. And the pizza slices here indicate by their color and by their extent from the center of the circle how far we've gone toward or beyond planetary limits. And what you can see is that genetic diversity as a subcategory of biodiversity, we've probably gone too far. We have increased biodiversity loss, species extinction by about 1,000-fold above natural baselines. When it comes to biogeochemical flows, we have probably exceeded safe limits. And with climate change, we are in the danger zone. Land use, land system change, we're probably in the danger zone. And when it comes to chemicals and aerosol loading, we don't really even know enough about where the limits are to be able to make a judgment about whether we have approached those limits or not. But this is a fragile and worrisome situation. One of the processes through which we have exceeded limits or are at the risk of exceeding limits is climate change, and everybody in the room is very familiar with this. This is one of many systems diagrams explaining the impacts of climate change on health. You can see direct effects like floods, heat waves, and so on. You can see secondary effects mediated through biodiversity loss, through changes in agricultural productivity and other things leading to the risk of various diseases, mental health, cardiovascular disease. And you can see tertiary effects mediated through more complex social phenomena, migration, armed conflict, and so on. It's one example of how these planetary changes are affecting health. Well, what does that all have to do with the topic of today's get-together, communities at the scale of cities, metro areas? So what are the urban impacts? Well, climate change, as an example of a planetary change, affects cities in quite specific and well-characterized ways. One is heat waves. Cities produce heat islands because of a number of physical features of cities that we are well aware of, and the death toll can be terrible during heat waves that affect cities. Cities are often in the path of disasters, so possibilities of flooding, of severe rainfall events, of sea level rise, given that a number of major cities around the world are in coastal areas. Cities are quite vulnerable in this respect. The air sheds in cities are vulnerable. And this particular city, as those of you who live here well know, is affected when there are upwind wildfires. The levels of contaminants in the air sheds of downwind from wildfires can rival the levels of contaminants in Beijing or Delhi on a bad day, and mortality noticeably rises. Turns out that infectious diseases relate to cities as well, because diseases such as dengue and the vectors that spread dengue, Aedes aegypti, happen to live near where people live. And so cities essentially bioconcentrate the risk for dengue. So, and dengue, of course, is related to climatic conditions. So a number of features of climate change that affect cities. And that leads to the issue of resilience. In some ways, what I want to talk about is not only the question of how do planetary changes affect the health and well-being of people in cities, but I'm also, I realized, addressing the question, if Dick and Larry and I were doing this book again, what are some of the things that we didn't talk about very much that we should be talking about? And this is one of them. We didn't talk very much about urban resilience in the book, but resilience, the ability to anticipate the kinds of challenges that I just talked about and to protect people from those challenges is extremely important. There's a very large literature, as you can see in recent years, on the concept of resilient cities. We know that these challenges to health and well-being are coming. What do we do about them? And one of the major funded efforts to help us with that on a global scale is the 100 Resilient Cities program funded by the Rockefeller Foundation. You can see that they began listing the features of cities. They had a list that began with R. It was the Rockefeller Foundation, after all. And then I think they ran out of R's at a certain point. But there is a set of conditions, some of which are physical conditions that planners and engineers can accomplish, but some of which are social and governance-related conditions that are essentially the software of cities. And when cities get those right, cities can become more resilient. What I find interesting on this list is that one of the things that's not shown there is social capital, social connectedness, which we in public health love because it's good for health. It turns out it's also one of the strongest predictors of a community making it through a disaster and recovering. So we might want to add this to the Rockefeller list. The concept of resiliency in cities is an extremely important one in the context of the global changes that are coming and affecting cities. There's another feature of climate change that I want to talk about, and that's migration. And it's very relevant to cities in ways that we hardly ever talk about. So here are a couple of big numbers. And you might wonder what those numbers are. The first number is the number of immigrants in the world in 2015. This is a 40% increase just in 15 years. The second number is the number of forcibly displaced people. It's now higher than it's been since the Second World War. We are in an age of migration. This is extremely important in terms of the health and well-being of the people who relocate. It's also extremely important in the political sense, that the rise of Trump here, the rise of autocrats and tyrants around Europe has everything to do with anti-migrant sentiment that is whipped up by demagogues. And so this is a political phenomenon as well as a phenomenon affecting the health and well-being of the people who are affected. There is such a thing as climate migration. The extent of climate migration is debated. We hardly talk about it here in the US. And I want to raise it for discussion and hope that we can talk about it. So a few people, Dick asked who's the oldest person in the audience. Whoever that oldest person is may remember Atlantis when it existed, and then it went underground. This is Plato talking about Atlantis, and that is an actual photograph of Atlantis that I took during a recent visit. Well, this is Miami Beach. And the picture you see on the upper right is what has been called a high tide sunny day phenomenon, high tide sunny day flooding. This is happening on a regular basis in Miami Beach. Here is a tracing of the flooding events per year over the last 20 years or so. And the green ones that you see here are related to the tide. This is an effect of a rising ocean level. How many people think Miami Beach is going to be there untouched in 100 years given this trend line? Well, the typical thing that mayors do after a disaster, including after floods, is we're going to beat this. We're going to come back stronger than ever. We're going to be resilient. I mean, a mayor has no choice but to talk that way, even in the face of reality orientation that would steer you in an entirely different direction. But it's not just flooding. This is a map of the projected number of days that will exceed 100 degrees by the late 21st century. So if you happen to be in El Paso or in Phoenix or anywhere along the border of Texas there, southern Arizona, southern Mexico, you will be looking at 1 day in 3 being over 100 degrees, and some days being over 120 degrees. So among the pressures that might drive people to leave a place, not just the flooding in a place like Miami Beach, but how about the extreme heat making a place close to unlivable? This is a picture of the change in the number of drought months that are predicted in about 50 years relative to the 20th century baseline. Drought is a huge phenomenon, and what you can see here is that the 113 to 145 days, months of drought over this 30-year period, or roughly a few months of drought every year, or multiple years continually of a prolonged drought, will be coming in much of the southwestern part of the country. So there's heat that could make cities tough to live in. There is drought that could make cities tough to live in. Water shortage is an issue in many parts of the Southwest in particular. And getting back to flooding, this is a projection from Climate Central of the cities most vulnerable to coastal flooding by the year 2050. And you can see that there is a non-trivial number of cities. The entire city won't go underwater, but coastal areas of the city will be regularly, if not permanently, underwater. And so you can see in New York, it's almost 500,000 people. In Boston, 62,000 people, and so on. A number of our coastal cities are at imminent risk of long-term flooding. This is another projection using different methods of so-called effectively inundated coastal communities. That is not just occasional floods or frequent floods, but being underwater. And you can see regionally, where are we? Savannah, Charleston, Miami, New Orleans. These are cities that are highly likely to be flooded. Well, so if it isn't heat or flood or drought, or maybe a combination of those things, people may have to vacate cities Atlantis style. Where will they go? So Larry, you're the planner. How many cities in this country are actually planning for the relatively short-term sudden influx of 100,000 or 500,000 immigrants? This is not a far-fetched question to ask. It's been modeled a little bit. Here's one publication that modeled where the receiving areas would be, and this is just due to sea level rise, using relatively moderate assumptions of sea level rise. And what you see is that you can barely make it out, but the blue-greens are the receiving areas, and the reds are the areas with net losses expected. And let's look at the statistical area picture rather than the county area. You can see Seattle, the upper Midwest, Dallas, Atlanta, receiving large numbers of people. All of these are places that have shortages of housing, and especially of affordable housing, that have inadequate transportation infrastructure, that are pressed for green space, that have school systems that are barely making it. None of them is prepared to handle a large sudden influx of people. So this needs to be on our agenda, I would submit to you. Okay, mitigation. Not only do cities need to be resilient to climate change, but cities need to be and can take the leadership in mitigating, in reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Why cities? Well, because cities are where much of the economic activity in the world takes place and where a lot of the political will is. And this is, of course, especially true in our country, where the federal government has left this space. But around the world, huge amounts of leadership are being taken by cities. Cities have enormous opportunities, given the economies of scale with which we can move people around, given the smaller living space per capita and per family, meaning fewer energy demands, given the economies of scale of moving food from farm to market. Cities can be, and in many cases are, leaders in mitigating climate change. So our goals for cities need not only to be healthy places, which we've been talking about all morning and will continue to talk about, but also places that lead in climate mitigation. They need to be ecologically sustainable places as well. And that raises the question of politics. Are cities prepared to step up to the plate and do this? Well, a lot of us work in environmental health. Mike, you chair the Department of Environmental Health. The biggest immediate threat to environmental health is, I said I was going to be political. And at least for this week, this may change, today's newspaper is encouraging on this point. Well, how did we get to that point? We elected him. And how did we get to that point? Well, we had an election. And you've all seen this map. Little islands of blue in a sea of red. That's interesting, isn't it? Those little islands of blue are cities. Let me show you some blow-up maps. I find this fascinating and hope you do too. These are red states. These are states that went for Trump. And what you see is the same pattern. So here's Ohio. Here's Columbus. Here's Cleveland. Here's Cincinnati. Here's Toledo. The cities go blue, and the rest of the state goes red. And you see this pattern recurrently in state after state. And you see an almost similar pattern in the states that went for Clinton. These are blue states. So here's New York. You see Buffalo, Rochester, Syracuse, Albany, and New York City. Here's Minnesota with Minneapolis and Duluth sticking out bluely. This is so much the case that there is, I would submit to you, a bigger gulf between city and not city than there is between blue state and red state. Cities are a politically different creature than not cities. These are the 39 largest cities in the country. How far down the list do you think you have to go before you get to a city that voted for Trump? So this is a really significant observation, I think. Cities matter not only as human habitat, and we need to make them great human habitat, but cities are the place in which we can make progress, and we are making progress. And so from environmental sustainability to social justice to human health, the country of cities is the country where we can expect progress. Okay, the last thing I'll say, I got 1 minute, this is perfect timing. We focused in our book on the US and on US-like settings. And we talked about urban sprawl, and we talked about automobile dependence and so on. But one can't forget that most of the urban dwellers in the world live in cities of the global south. Most population growth over the course of the coming century will be in cities of the global south. And those are very, very hard-hit places. These are slums in Nairobi. Here you have Caracas, and this looked pretty good. Caracas has had very hard times in the last 15 years. It's probably a lot worse than this now. Here's Jakarta. Here's Manila. These are very, very hard places to live and very unhealthy places to live. This is Port-au-Prince, Haiti. This body of water in the foreground here is delicately known as a sewage lagoon. Here's Anshan, China. So cities in poor nations face a whole set of issues that we have to have top of mind when we think globally. The absence of basic infrastructure, which characterized cities of the West in the 19th century and triggered the birth of modern public health. Extremely hazardous exposures ranging from air quality to roads that you can't walk on for fear of getting killed. And then some of the software, land tenure that's poorly defined in many places so that people can't own their land or be secure living there. Poor governance, corruption, inadequate social services. That is different than the set of problems that we talked about in wealthy nations, which you can see listed here. Now, they're not completely different worlds. Cities generically have some overlapping sets of problems that you see here. But the take-home message here is that we need to be global citizens. We need to think about our brothers and sisters who live in cities of the global south, understand that the set of urban challenges is very different and in many cases much more challenging than the ones we face here. So we need to think very globally as we proceed. So here's the list of points I've teed up for conversation. I'm really looking forward to the next part of our session together, in which I think Charles will either interrogate us or open things up to all of you. Thank you very much. Should we go up there?